Hi guys. So I'm really sorry I can't be there. I'm going to try and take you through as much of this, um, compensate for my absence as best I possibly can, um, by screencasting basically the rest of this story, so you can check it over the week-long break and make sure that you're fully up to scratch with the details and the annotations of this text. And for those of you in high level, the extension one. Um, as far as I can remember, we'd got to the bottom of Caroline and Hubert's little streams of consciousness, as we've seen. And we begun this section here, where the narrative perspective zooms back out. They walked on the past, they walked on past the flower bed, now walking four abreast, and soon diminished in size among the trees and looked half transparent as the sunlight and shade swam over their backs in large, trembling, irregular patches. And so we've got, in this short little paragraph, a beautiful piece of writing that captures the perspective shift of the narrative perspective. And Woolf's extremely clever with the way she depicts this. They soon diminished in size, obviously gives them their appearance the sense of actively shrinking, but of course that shrinking is purely on the basis of the narrative consciousness taking greater distance from them. And I think it also brings a sense of perspective, of playfulness towards perspective that equates them with the snail who follows. It makes them small. And so as they move among the trees and they appear to be half transparent, they appear to be almost see-through or partly see-through, so they become insubstantial almost. They disappear as the sunlight and shade swim over their backs. And so the sunlight and shade are personified, swimming over their backs in these large, trembling, irregular patches. And they're almost disappearing into the scene, almost dissolving. But with a sense of energy and vitality. And so that they seem insubstantial, but they're disappearing in this in this moment in this moment of energy in terms of light. And then there's a transformation to the snail's perspective. In the oval flower bed, the snail, whose shell had been stained red, blue, and yellow for the space of 2 or so minutes, now appeared to be moving very slightly in its shell. And so there's a sense here of this snail being tainted, stained by the light of the flowers above it. And that we see here in this the connotations of this phrase, that life is both beautiful and a burden. You know, we think of stained glass as something kind of ominous and threatening, as well as beautiful and impressive from an aesthetic perspective. I think we've got something similar here, that life is incredibly difficult. You know, we've got this narrative of this snail sneaking across the turf and encountering all these obstacles, and yet there's a sense of beauty about that vitality and life. It labours over the loose crumbs of earth, which broke away and rolled down as it passed over them. It appeared to have a definite goal in front of it, differing in this respect from the singular, high-stepping, angular green insect who attempted to cross in front of it and waited for a second with its antennae trembling as if in deliberation, and then stepped off as rapidly and strangely in the opposite direction. So these animals, I think, mirror the sense of distance and proximity, that tension of close space and alienation that we see in lots of the characters. But in this imagery, we've got this microscopic animal imagery that shifts the sense of perspective and significance and shows us that really there's nothing that is beyond the importance and significance that is worthy of narrative perception. And that's what I think is deliberately constructed through the imagery that Woolf uses in the remainder of this, which magnifies the perspective and shows us, I think, metaphorically the process of narration in the text, that these brown cliffs with deep green lakes in the hollows, flat blade-like trees that waved from root to tip, round boulders of grey stone, vast crumpled surfaces of a thin crackling texture. All of these basically hyperbolic exaggerations of the little pebbles and stones and leaves and stems of plants in a flower bed are seen from the insect's perspective. And all these objects lay across the snail's progress between one stalk and another to his goal. Before he had decided whether to circumvent the arched tent of a dead leaf or to breast it there, came past the bed the feet of other human beings. And it's almost as if he is one of their number here, in that the snail's progress is just as significant, and actually, ironically, in this description, is even more significant than the lives of the individuals that surround. And this transition is the shift to William and the senile older man. And we want to pay close attention to the way Woolf characterizes William, because there's something extremely restrained about it, because we are given only the old man's internal life. This time they were both men. The younger of the two wore an expression of perhaps unnatural calm, and this is what we're talking about. William is exceptionally patient and focused on the needs of the old man. He raised his eyes and fixed them very steadily in front of him while his companion spoke. He seems here, William, focused entirely on the man himself, but perhaps actually, you could read that fixed gaze as if he's indifferent to the actual content of the man's thoughts, and that once again we see two people in close proximity, but at miles of distance between each other. And directly after his companion had done speaking, he looked on the ground again, and sometimes opened his lips only after a long pause, and sometimes did not open them at all. And so there's this very microscopic description of his body language that I think shows us this brief moment of the possibility of communication, but in the end that communication is futile, and so the two men seem completely separate and alienated from one another. The elder man had a curiously uneven and shaky method of walking, jerking his hand forward and throwing up his head abruptly, rather in the manner of an impatient carriage horse tired of waiting outside a house. So again, the man is depicted using this animalized or animal imagery, which is the way that Woolf shows us, I think, that the distance between the two men is due to his insanity. But again, it collapses the distinction between human and animal that she is very keen to do as she oscillates between this microscopic perspective of the snail and this broader perspective of the characters in Kew Gardens. But in the man, these gestures were irresolute and pointless. They're just frantic, nervous energy. They don't have an end goal. He talked almost incessantly. And so this, I think, is a contrast to William, who doesn't even move his lips. This man talks without stopping. He smiled to himself and began again to talk as if the smile had been an answer. And so here this man is trapped in his own private psychological world and seems to be having a dialogue in a way that no one else can. And so even his dialogue here is only plausible because he's mad. He's having a dialogue and the possibility of communication, and perhaps even the sensation of not being alienated from someone else if he's having an imaginary friend taking part in his dialogue. That is the only way that we seem to be able to overcome emotional and psychological alienation in this story. He was talking about spirits, the spirits of the dead, who, according to him, were even now telling him all sorts of odd things about their experiences in heaven. And it's deliberately illogical, but there is, I think, a suggestion here of his own mortality, and perhaps that sort of deathly glimpse into the abyss that is perhaps the cause of his insanity. And then we move into his mind. Heaven was known to the ancients as Thessaly, William, and now with this war, the spirit matter is rolling between the hills like thunder. And this is where we have this this man supposedly insane, but perhaps having a profound insight into the external world that we're not being given in this little scene in London in a park during the First World War. And so there's this reminder of the looming of World War One and the disaster of technology in this particular little insight from his supposedly nonsensical thoughts. With this war, the spirit matter is rolling between the hills like thunder. And that simile is extremely powerful. You know, this is one of the most powerful images in the text, and it comes from the mouth of an insane man, supposedly. The spirit matter, that the souls of the slaughtered dead in World War One rolling between the hills like thunder, imagining that the sound of thunder is that trapped agony of all of the souls of the dead rolling around in that great, powerful acoustic abyss. He paused, seemed to listen, smiled, jerked his head, and continued. And so there's almost in this description of his body, this characterization, a sense of aesthetic relish that he's performing these lines in order to have this powerful, dramatic impact. You have a small electric battery and a piece of rubber to insulate the wire. Isolate, insulate? Well, we'll skip the details. No good going into details that wouldn't be understood. And in short, the little machine stands in any convenient position by the head of the bed, we will say, on a neat mahogany stand, all arrangements being properly fixed by a workman under my direction. The widow applies her ear and summons the spirit by sign as agreed. Women, widows, women in black. And so he seems to be describing some sort of mechanical contrivance. And that this, I think, functions as a metaphor for Woolf's purpose in the story. No good going into details that wouldn't be understood. And that's precisely what she is attempting to do in this narrative by giving us these powerful glimpses into the minds of these characters, to penetrate their consciousness and to give them this sense of revelation. Again, even though this following description of this device is supposedly nonsensical, there is, I think, the description of communication with the dead in this particular sort of illusory fantasy of his mind. And that his private consciousness, I think, provides, I think, a counterpoint to the young couple. He is the person that is communing with the end. He is the one that is seeing the end of life, whereas the young couple that conclude the story are the ones that are at the beginning. They're at the very beginning of vitality. Here, he seems to have caught sight of a woman's dress in the distance, which in the shade looked a purple black. And again, perception itself in this line is subjective and relative. He took off his hat, placed his hand upon his heart, and hurried towards her, muttering and gesticulating feverishly. And so there's a tension in these lines between the obvious significance for him and its incoherence for the readers. You know, he appears to have seen someone who he knows and has established a sense of intimacy that has overcome his sense of alienation. But of course, we don't know who that is and why. And we're not given that. We stay outside of his mind here. And that's a deliberate strategy on Woolf's part, I think, to keep us alienated from him. But William caught him by the sleeve and touched a flower with the tip of his walking stick in order to divert the old man's attention. And so there's this, in spite of this slightly sort of humiliating control of this man and the suggestion of his insanity, there is this suggestion of the awe-inspiring vitality of nature, that William can just tap a flower with his walking stick and it can compel this man and completely overwhelm this seemingly powerful realization that he's had in the sentence above. It says, after looking at it for a moment in some confusion, the old man bent his ear to it and seemed to answer a voice speaking from it. And so, again, there's this sense, I think, here of his insanity, but it's similar to the process of others, that he's imagining, communing with someone through the inspiration that he takes in the natural world. So even though he is bonkers, the process is not all that difficult. It is different, you know, looking at the scene and that scene inspiring us to some form of mental life and vitality that is not immediately apparent. And he begins talking about the forests of Uruguay, which he had visited hundreds of years ago, in company with the most beautiful young woman in Europe. So then, even in his supposedly nonsensical and fragmentary dreams, there is this desire for youth and vitality that's been lost, which is just like the men in the rest of the story. Even though he's insane, he has more in common with them than I think than distinguishes him from them. He could be heard murmuring about forests of Uruguay blanketed with the wax petals of tropical roses, nightingales, sea beaches, mermaids, and women drowned at sea as he suffered himself to be moved on by William, upon whose face the look of stoical patience grew slowly deeper and deeper. And so here, the process of distance is at its peak and is most explicit here as William is stoically patient. He's sort of deliberately self-restrained in his patience, whilst this man is having this dynamic, wild fantasy, which actually sounds to me quite tremendous. And you look at this juxtaposition between the two here and wonder who's happier. You know, there isn't necessarily the suggestion that one is superior to the other, and that actually the minds of these two people are quite distant and separate from each other, but that one is neither superior to the other.